The year is 1922. In the crumbling halls of the Topkapi Palace, the last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, sits alone in a room that once housed the most powerful rulers on earth. The silk cushions are faded now, the gold leaf peeling from the walls, the servants few and frightened. Outside these ancient walls, the empire that lasted 600 years is breathing its final breath. But here's what history books won't tell you. The collapse didn't happen in 1922. It didn't happen in a single moment of defeat or surrender. The Ottoman Empire died slowly, methodically, across 5 distinct stages that took over a century to complete. And right now, as you watch this, the United States of America is sitting at stage 4. The same stage that sealed the fate of the Ottomans. The same stage that brought the mighty Mongol Empire to its knees. The same stage that transformed Persia from a global power into a nation carved up by foreign interests like a carcass divided among vultures. What you're about to discover isn't just history. It's a pattern. A blueprint that has repeated itself across centuries and continents with terrifying precision. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The question isn't whether this pattern is real. The question is whether it's already too late to stop it. To understand where we are, we must first understand how empires truly die. Not in the dramatic fashion of Hollywood movies, with armies clashing and capitals burning in spectacular conflagrations. No, the death of an empire is far more insidious, far more quiet, far more complete. It happens in ledgers and loan agreements, in the quiet scratching of pens signing away sovereignty. It happens in the slow erosion of purchasing power and the gradual transfer of wealth from citizens to creditors. It happens when a nation begins to consume more than it produces, borrows more than it can repay, and prints money to cover the difference. The end, when it comes, is not a surprise to those who understand this pattern. It is merely the final page of a story whose ending was written decades earlier. This is the pattern. This is the 5-stage collapse that has destroyed every empire that walked this path. Stage 1 begins with what historians call the Age of Expansion. Every great empire starts here, fueled by conquest, innovation, or the discovery of new resources. The Ottoman Empire's Stage 1 lasted from 1299 to roughly 1566, the glorious reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. During this extraordinary period, the Ottomans transformed from a minor Anatolian principality into the masters of an empire spanning 3 continents. They conquered Constantinople in 1453, that legendary city that had resisted siege for 1,000 years, and remade it as Istanbul, the new capital of their growing dominion. They seized control of crucial trade routes between Europe and Asia, positioned themselves as gatekeepers of global commerce, and built an economy based on real productivity. Gold and silver flowed into the treasury from conquered lands, from tax trade, from the productive labor of millions of subjects. The currency, the aki, was sound and trusted throughout the known world. Its silver content was reliable, its value stable. Merchants from Venice to Persia, from Morocco to the Indian Ocean, accepted Ottoman money without hesitation because it represented actual value, backed by the empire's vast resources and genuine productive capacity. A worker could save money knowing that its value would remain. A merchant could plan for the future with confidence. This was the foundation of imperial greatness, a currency that meant something because it represented something real. The Mongol Empire experienced its Stage 1 under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors, a period of conquest so vast it staggers the imagination. From 1206 to approximately 1260, the Mongols conquered the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to Persia. At its height, a traveler could journey for thousands of miles across Mongol territory, and everywhere the rule of the great Khan held sway. But the Mongols didn't just destroy, they built. They established the Yam, a sophisticated postal and relay system that allowed information to travel from one end of the empire to the other in days rather than months. They facilitated trade along the Silk Road, protecting merchants and establishing standardized weights and measures. They created a period of peace and commerce known as the Pax Mongolica, during which ideas, technologies, and goods flowed freely across the vast Eurasian landmass. Wealth flowed into the empire from every corner of the known world in the form of tribute, trade revenue, and plunder. The Mongols collected gold, silver, silk, spices, and slaves. Their economy was real, tangible, based on conquest and trade rather than financial engineering or monetary tricks. Persia's Stage 1, under the Safavid dynasty beginning in 1501, saw the transformation of the region into a cultural and economic powerhouse that rivaled any in the world. Shah Abbas the Great, perhaps the most capable ruler of his age, built Isfahan into one of the world's most magnificent cities. European visitors reported that Isfahan's main square was larger than any in Europe, its bazaars more richly stocked, its craftsmen more skilled. Persian silk became the most sought-after luxury in Europe, commanding prices that made fortunes for merchants who could secure even small quantities. The economy thrived on production and trade, on the creation of real goods that the world desired. The currency maintained its value because it represented actual goods and services, not the promises of ministers or the whims of rulers. Now consider the United States. Stage 1 began arguably with the post-Civil War industrial expansion and accelerated through the early 20th century. The transformation was breathtaking. In 1865, America was still largely an agricultural nation recovering from a devastating civil war. By 1900, it had become the world's largest industrial economy. By 1945, America had become the undisputed workshop of the world, producing steel, automobiles, machinery, and technology on a scale never before achieved in human history. American factories produced half of the world's manufactured goods. American farms fed nations. American innovations, electricity, the telephone, the automobile, the airplane, remade human civilization itself. The dollar, backed by gold and by this tremendous productive capacity, became the most trusted currency on earth. Foreign governments held dollars as reserves. International trade was conducted in dollars. The currency meant something because it represented something, the vast productive power of a nation that made things the world needed. This was the foundation, the golden age when the empire's currency reflected genuine economic strength. Stage 2 is where the seeds of destruction are planted, though few recognize them at the time. This is the age of overextension, when success breeds the ambitions that will eventually destroy it. Military commitments expand beyond sustainable limits. Administrative costs multiply. The ruling class becomes accustomed to luxuries that require ever-growing revenues. The costs of maintaining an empire begin to exceed the revenues generated by it. But the economy is still strong enough to absorb these costs, at least temporarily. The future is mortgaged, but the payments are not yet due. The Ottoman Stage 2 began after Suleiman's death in 1566 and continued through the 17th century. The empire continued to expand territorially, fighting costly wars against the Habsburgs in Europe, the Safavids in Persia, and eventually the emerging European powers whose military technology was beginning to surpass Ottoman capabilities. But the conquests were yielding diminishing returns. The easy plunder was gone, the wealthy cities had already been conquered, their treasuries already emptied. Each new war cost more than the last, requiring larger armies equipped with increasingly expensive gunpowder weapons. And the territories acquired produced less revenue than expected, requiring garrisons and administrators who consumed resources rather than generating them. The empire remained magnificent, remained powerful, but the mathematics had shifted. The trend line, invisible to most observers, had begun its slow decline. The Mongol Stage 2 emerged after the death of Monk Khan in 1259, when the unified empire fractured into four khanates, each pursuing its own ambitions while nominally acknowledging the authority of the Great Khan. Each successor state maintained massive military forces, continued expensive campaigns of conquest, and found that the costs of administration and defense were growing faster than the revenues from trade and tribute. The army still won battles, but each victory cost more than the last. The empire was still rich, still powerful, but the trajectory had shifted. Expenses were beginning to outpace income, though the reserves accumulated during Stage 1 were sufficient to mask the problem for decades. For Persia, Stage 2 came in the late Safavid period, when expensive wars with the Ottomans and the Mughals of India drained the treasury while court expenses and military costs continued to climb unchecked. The Shahs built magnificent palaces and maintained enormous harems while their armies demanded more money and their bureaucrats required ever larger payments. The empire was living beyond its means, but the reserves built during the glory years were still sufficient to mask the problem from all but the most perceptive observers. The American stage too is harder to pinpoint precisely, but most economic historians place it somewhere between 1945 and 1971. The United States emerged from World War II as the undisputed global superpower, but with this status came the burden of empire. Military bases spread across the globe like mushrooms after rain. By 1960, America maintained over 1,000 military installations in foreign countries. The Cold War demanded constant military readiness, a nuclear arsenal capable of destroying civilization, and expensive technological competition with the Soviet Union. The Korean War consumed resources. The Vietnam War, that endless quagmire, drained blood and treasure for a generation. And beyond the military commitments, there were the endless obligations to allies, the foreign aid programs, the maintenance of the global order that American power guaranteed. But America was still rich, still productive, and the dollar was still as good as gold. Foreign nations held dollars because they knew they could exchange them for gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This was the foundation of the Bretton Woods system, the global monetary order that had made America the banker to the world. The bills were accumulating, but they had not yet come due. Stage 3 is the turning point, the Rubicon that, once crossed, determines the empire's ultimate fate. This is the age of monetary debasement. Facing growing expenses and stagnant or declining revenues, the empire makes a fateful choice. Rather than cut spending or increase taxes, both politically painful, it chooses to devalue its currency. This decision provides temporary relief. Bills can be paid with cheaper money. Obligations can be met, at least nominally. But this choice sets in motion a process that cannot be reversed without tremendous pain that grows greater the longer the debasement continues. The Ottoman Stage 3 began in earnest in the late 16th century with the so-called price revolution that swept through the empire. Silver from the Spanish Americas flooded into the global economy, disrupting price structures that had been stable for generations. But rather than adjust their fiscal policies to this new reality, the Ottomans chose the easier path. They began debasing their currency, reducing the silver content of the aki while maintaining its face value. Coins that once contained pure metal were increasingly mixed with copper and other base alloys. The markets were not fooled. Prices rose to compensate for the reduced value of the money. Soldiers and bureaucrats demanded higher pay to maintain their standard of living. The empire responded by minting more debased coins, which only accelerated the inflation. The janissaries, the elite soldiers who had once been the terror of Europe, began demanding payment in pure silver rather than debased coinage. When their demands were not met, they revolted, and their revolts became increasingly frequent as the century progressed. A vicious cycle had begun, each turn of the spiral making the next turn more severe. The empire that had once commanded respect across 3 continents was now struggling to pay its own soldiers. The Mongol Stage 3, specifically in the Yuan dynasty of Kublai Khan, took an even more dramatic and instructive form. Beginning in the 1260s, Kublai Khan introduced paper money to China on a scale never before attempted in human history. This innovation seemed miraculous to observers of the time. The empire could create wealth simply by printing it on paper. The Great Khan's seal made worthless mulberry bark into currency that could command goods and services throughout the realm. Taxes could be collected in paper. Soldiers could be paid with paper. The economy seemed to flourish, freed from the constraints of precious metal supplies. But the temptation to print proved irresistible. When revenues fell short, the solution was always the same: print more notes. When military expenses exceeded expectations, the printing presses ran faster. When floods or famines required government response, more paper appeared. By the 1350s, the yuan paper currency had become essentially worthless. Prices had risen by factors of 10, then 100, then more. Merchants refused to accept the government's money. Trade collapsed into barter. The sophisticated economy that had made China the wonder of the world dissolved into chaos. The dynasty fell not to foreign invasion but to peasant revolts sparked by economic desperation. Persia's stage 3 came under the Qajar dynasty in the 19th century, when the government, facing mounting debts and declining revenues from traditional sources, began granting concessions to foreign powers in exchange for immediate cash. The currency was repeatedly devalued, each devaluation announced as a necessity, each one eroding the foundation further. Foreign merchants and diplomats gained extraordinary privileges. The empire was selling its future to pay for its present, trading permanent losses for temporary relief. The American Stage 3 began on a specific date that should be taught in every school but is known to few, August 15, 1971. On that evening, President Richard Nixon appeared on television to announce what he called a new economic policy. In reality, he was announcing that the United States would no longer honor its commitment to convert dollars to gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. The dollar would become a fiat currency, backed by nothing but the faith and credit of the United States government. This wasn't presented as a crisis. It was sold as liberation. Nixon's advisors framed it as freeing America from the constraints of the gold standard, enabling more flexible economic policy. The markets, we were told, would welcome this new freedom. And for a time they did. America was freed from the discipline of the gold standard. The government could now create as much money as it needed, whenever it needed it. And create it did. The numbers tell a story of monetary expansion unprecedented in American history. In 1971, the total U.S. money supply measured by M2 was approximately $600 billion. By 1980, just 9 years later, it had grown to $1.6 trillion. By 1990, it reached $3.2 trillion. By 2000, $4.9 trillion. By 2010, $8.5 trillion. By 2020, on the eve of the pandemic, $15.4 trillion. And then came the response to COVID-19, the most dramatic monetary expansion in human history. Trillions of dollars were created in months. By 2023, the M2 money supply had exploded to over $21 trillion. In 50 years, the money supply grew by a factor of 35. The dollar of 1971 is worth approximately 6 cents today in terms of purchasing power. A house that cost $25,000 in 1971 now costs over $400,000. A car that cost $3,000 now costs $48,000. A college education that cost $1,000 per year now costs $25,000 or more. This is not natural inflation, not the gentle rise in prices that accompanies a healthy economy. This is monetary debasement on a historic scale, comparable to what the Ottomans did to their Aki, or what Kublai Khan did to his paper currency. Stage 4 is where the empire begins to lose control of its destiny, where the mathematics of debt overwhelm the strategies of ministers and the pronouncements of rulers. This is the age of debt dependency. Having debased its currency, the empire finds that it can no longer finance itself through currency creation alone. Inflation erodes the value of new money faster than it can be printed. Creditors demand higher interest rates to compensate for the declining value of the currency. The empire must now borrow, and it must borrow from foreign creditors who demand real returns. The Ottoman Stage 4 began in the 1850s when the empire, having exhausted its ability to debase the currency further without causing complete economic collapse, turned to European banks for loans. The first major foreign loan came in 1854, ostensibly to finance the Crimean War, that distant conflict in which the Ottomans found themselves allied with Britain and France against Russia. The terms seemed reasonable, even generous. European bankers were eager to lend to the Ottomans, seeing both profit opportunity and political advantage. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. That first loan set a precedent. It established the principle that the Ottoman Empire could finance its deficits through foreign borrowing rather than domestic reform. More loans followed. The Ottomans borrowed to pay for military modernization. They borrowed to build railroads. They borrowed to finance administrative reforms. And increasingly, they borrowed simply to pay the interest on previous loans, the classic death spiral of compound debt. Each loan came with conditions. Creditors demanded preferential treatment for their merchants. They demanded the right to establish courts that would judge disputes involving their citizens according to European rather than Ottoman law. They demanded access to Ottoman markets on terms favorable to European manufacturers. Each condition reduced Ottoman sovereignty, each represented a small surrender of independence, each was accepted because the alternative, default, seemed worse. By 1875, the empire was spending over half its revenues on debt service, not on the military that defended its borders, not on public works that might generate future prosperity, not on the welfare of its people, but on interest payments to foreign banks. The Ottoman government collected taxes from peasants in Anatolia and immediately shipped the money to bondholders in London and Paris. The empire had become a mechanism for transferring wealth from its poorest subjects to the richest financiers in Europe. In 1881, the inevitable happened. The Ottoman Empire effectively declared bankruptcy, unable to service its debts even by the most creative accounting. A committee of European creditors, organized as the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, took control of significant portions of the empire's revenues. This foreign body, staffed by foreigners and answering to foreign interests, collected taxes directly, managed monopolies, and directed funds to European creditors before the Ottoman government could spend them. The empire still existed on paper, the Sultan still sat on his throne, the armies still marched, the flags still flew. But the Ottoman Empire had become a financial colony, its sovereignty hollowed out, its future mortgaged to foreign powers who viewed it not as a partner but as an asset to be stripped. The Mongol Stage 4, particularly in the Yuan dynasty, saw the empire desperately trying to restore confidence in its currency while simultaneously depending on loans from merchants and regional powers. The contradictions were irreconcilable. Paper money was effectively worthless, but the government still demanded taxes in paper, and punished those who refused to accept it. Trade collapsed as merchants refused to extend credit or transport goods for payment in depreciating currency. Regions broke away, their leaders recognizing that the center could no longer compel obedience because it could no longer pay its enforcers. The central government lost the ability to pay or feed its armies, and unpaid soldiers became bandits or rebels. Within decades, the dynasty collapsed entirely, swept away by peasant armies led by a former monk who had found the Ming dynasty on the ruins of Mongol power. Persia's Stage 4 under the Qajars saw the nation fall completely under the financial control of Britain and Russia, two great powers who viewed Persia not as a nation with rights and dignity but as a buffer zone to be divided between their spheres of influence. The 1901 Darcy Oil Concession gave Britain exclusive rights to Persian oil for 60 years, in exchange for a modest payment and a mere 16% of profits. Persia had discovered that it sat atop one of the world's great oil reserves, and it sold this treasure for a pittance because it could not manage its debts and needed immediate cash. By 1907, Britain and Russia had formally divided Persia into zones of influence, with a nominally neutral zone in between. The nation that had once been a great empire, that had produced some of humanity's finest poetry and philosophy and art, was reduced to a line on a map drawn by foreign diplomats. It existed, but its economic independence was gone. Its resources flowed outward to enrich foreign powers while its people remained impoverished. Now consider where the United States stands today. The national debt exceeds $34 trillion. This number is so large that it defies human comprehension, so let us attempt some perspective. If you stack 34 trillion $1 bills, the pile would reach to the moon and back more than 4 times. If you spend $1 every second without stopping, day and night, without pause for sleep or food, it would take you over 1,000,000 years, to spend $34 trillion. This debt represents over $100,000 for every single American citizen, including newborns and children who will inherit this burden without having incurred it. It represents over $260,000 per taxpayer. And it is growing at an extraordinary rate. Interest payments on this debt now exceed $800 billion annually, more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare, more than any other single expenditure except Social Security. The United States now pays more in interest than it spends defending itself. But here's the critical point that connects America's present to the Ottoman past. Much of this debt is held by foreign creditors. China holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. Japan holds a similar amount. Other nations hold trillions more. The United States, like the Ottoman Empire in the 1870s, now depends on the continued willingness of foreign creditors to finance its deficits. Every year, the Treasury must issue new bonds to replace maturing ones and to finance current deficits. If foreign creditors decide to stop buying, or worse, to sell, the consequences would be immediate and severe. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency, which provides some protection. Foreign central banks hold dollars because global trade is conducted in dollars, because oil is priced in dollars, because the international financial system runs on dollars. This gives America what French President Giscard d'Estaing called an exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow in its own currency, to run deficits that would destroy any other nation. But this status is not guaranteed. It was not guaranteed for the British pound, which held reserve currency status throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, until it didn't. It was not guaranteed for the Spanish silver dollar, which dominated global trade for centuries, until it didn't. The guilder, the florin, the denarius, all were once the world's money, and all were replaced when the empires that issued them declined. History does not make permanent exceptions. The signs of stage 4 are unmistakable to those willing to see them. Inflation, which was described as transitory by Federal Reserve officials in 2021, proved to be anything but. The fastest price increases in 40 years eroded the savings of ordinary Americans while the Federal Reserve scrambled to respond with interest rate increases that threatened to trigger a recession. The purchasing power of the dollar continues to erode, silently stealing from everyone who holds cash or bonds while enriching those who hold real assets. Real wages for most Americans have stagnated for decades when properly adjusted for inflation. A minimum wage worker in 1968 could afford more, in real terms, than a minimum wage worker today. The middle class, once the backbone of American prosperity, is shrinking, hollowed out by deindustrialization, crushed by housing costs, burdened by educational debt. Wealth inequality has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age, that period before the Great Depression when robber barons controlled the economy and workers labored in conditions we would find unacceptable today. The richest Americans now hold a greater share of national wealth than at any point in the past century. And the government responds to each crisis with the same solution: more borrowing, more money creation, more debt. Each solution plants the seeds of the next crisis. Each intervention requires a larger intervention to follow. The parallels to the Ottoman trajectory are striking enough to disturb anyone who studies them carefully. In the 1860s, Ottoman reformers genuinely believed they could borrow their way to modernization. They would take European loans, build railroads and ports and telegraph lines, modernize the military with European weapons and tactics, and eventually grow their way out of debt. It seemed logical. It seemed like a reasonable plan. But they underestimated the compounding nature of debt and the relentless demands of creditors. Each loan led to more loans. Each restructuring extracted more concessions. Each year, more revenue flowed to foreign creditors rather than domestic development. By 1881, when the Public Debt Administration took control, the empire's fate was sealed. It would stagger on for another 40 years, maintaining the forms of sovereignty while lacking its substance. It would fight wars and negotiate treaties and go through the motions of independence. But it was already a dead empire walking, its future already determined by decisions made decades earlier. The final collapse in 1922 was merely the last scene of a tragedy whose script had been written in the loan documents of the 1850s and 1860s. Stage 5 is the final act of this recurring drama, the age of collapse and transformation. This is not necessarily the end of the nation. People survive their empires. But it is the end of the empire's power and pretensions. The debt becomes mathematically unpayable. The currency becomes worthless or is replaced entirely. foreign creditors seize assets or impose punitive terms that strip remaining wealth. The nation's sovereignty is compromised beyond recovery. Its global influence evaporates like morning dew. It becomes a shadow of its former self, living on memories of past glory while newer powers dictate terms and carve up the remains. The Ottoman Stage 5 played out between 1881 and 1922, 4 decades of slow-motion collapse. The empire lost territory after territory to nationalist movements it could no longer suppress and to European powers it could no longer resist. Libya fell to Italy. The Balkans erupted in wars that stripped away European territories. World War I, entered in desperate alliance with Germany and Austria, proved to be the final catastrophe. Military defeat led to foreign occupation, to the Treaty of Sèvres that proposed to divide Anatolia itself among the victors. The empire that had once threatened Vienna was reduced to a rump state, humiliated and helpless. Only the Turkish War of Independence, led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, salvaged something from the wreckage, but what emerged was not a continuation of the Ottoman Empire but something entirely new. The Republic of Turkey survived only by fundamentally transforming itself, abandoning the imperial project entirely, abolishing the Sultanate and Caliphate, and building a new national identity from the ruins of universal empire. The Mongol Stage 5 saw the Yuan dynasty collapse between 1351 and 1368 in peasant revolts that swept away centuries of Mongol dominance. The Red Turban Rebellion, fueled by economic desperation and apocalyptic religious fervor, engulfed central China. Warlords carved out territories. The Mongol court, unable to pay its armies or feed its people, watched helplessly as its authority evaporated. The Ming dynasty that emerged was explicitly Chinese, consciously rejecting the Mongol legacy and returning to traditional Chinese governance. Elsewhere, the unified Mongol world fragmented irreversibly. The Ilkhanate in Persia dissolved into competing successor states. The Chagatai Khanate broke into warring factions. The Golden Horde slowly disintegrated over centuries, eventually conquered by the rising power of Muscovy. The unified Mongol Empire became a historical memory, a subject for scholars rather than a living power. Persia's Stage 5 culminated in the 20th century, with a series of humiliations that reduced the ancient nation to a plaything of foreign powers. The 1953 CIA-backed coup, Operation Ajax, removed the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh, whose crime was attempting to nationalize Persian oil, and installed a ruler compliant with Western interests. The nation that had once been a great empire, that had given humanity Cyrus and Darius and Zoroaster, was reduced to a geopolitical pawn whose resources existed to be extracted for the benefit of foreign corporations and foreign governments. The question that haunts historians and economists and thoughtful observers alike is whether Stage 5 is inevitable once Stage 4 is reached. The historical record offers some hope but much warning. Escape is possible but rare, requiring extraordinary leadership, painful sacrifices, and often a fundamental transformation of the nation's identity and ambitions. The Ottomans had reformers who tried. The Tanzimat modernizers genuinely attempted to restructure the empire's finances and institutions. But they were too late, the debts too large, the creditors too powerful, the internal resistance to change too entrenched. What would Stage 5 look like for the United States? It would not likely be military conquest. America's nuclear arsenal prevents that particular end. No foreign army will march through Washington. But economic collapse does not require foreign invasion. It might look like the dollar losing its reserve currency status, gradually or suddenly, forcing the nation to pay for imports in currencies it cannot print. Already, China and Russia trade in their own currencies. Already, nations discuss alternatives to dollar dominance. It might look like hyperinflation making the dollar worthless for ordinary Americans while the wealthy flee to hard assets, real estate, gold, foreign currencies, that maintain their value. The middle class, holding their savings in dollars, would be devastated. The poor, living paycheck to paycheck, would face prices rising faster than wages. Only those with real assets, with wealth convertible to forms that survive currency collapse, would emerge intact. It might look like foreign creditors demanding political concessions in exchange for continued financing, The same dynamic that allowed Britain to dictate Ottoman policy for decades before the empire's final collapse. Already, American foreign policy shows sensitivity to the concerns of major creditors. How much more sensitive would it become if those creditors threatened to dump their treasury holdings? It might look like the permanent decline of American living standards to levels that match the nation's actual productivity rather than its borrowed prosperity. The average American standard of living is sustained in part by borrowing, by the nation as a whole spending more than it produces, financing the difference with debt that foreigners are willing to hold. What happens when that willingness ends? The most troubling aspect of this analysis is that the transition from stage 4 to stage 5 is often not a dramatic event but a gradual realization. The Ottoman elite in 1890 did not believe they were living through the end of their empire. They went about their business, attended court functions, negotiated with European ambassadors, and believed they were managing temporary difficulties. They believed that the next reform would succeed where others had failed. They believed that the next loan, the next concession, the next military modernization would turn things around. They were wrong. By the time the depth of the crisis became undeniable to everyone, it was too late to change course. The patterns of history do not repeat exactly, but they rhyme with haunting precision, recurring themes in humanity's long symphony of rise and fall. Every empire that has walked this path has believed itself exceptional, different from those that came before, immune to the forces that destroyed its predecessors. The Ottomans believed their Islamic mandate, their role as protectors of the holy cities and successors to the caliphate, protected them from the fate of earlier empires. They were wrong. The Mongols believed their military supremacy, their horse-borne armies that had never known defeat in open battle, made them invincible. They were wrong. The Persians believed their cultural heritage, their ancient civilization stretching back to Cyrus the Great, entitled them to eternal greatness. They were wrong. But patterns are not destiny. History offers warnings, not prophecies. It illuminates paths but does not compel travel. The United States possesses advantages that these earlier empires lacked: a dynamic and innovative economy, tremendous natural resources still largely untapped, a culture of entrepreneurship and problem-solving, and most importantly, knowledge of this pattern itself. We can see what they could not see. We know where this road leads. The question is whether this knowledge will be used or whether it will be ignored in favor of comfortable illusions. The numbers do not care about exceptionalism. Compound interest does not respect military power. Mathematics does not make allowances for noble intentions or democratic ideals. The Ottomans discovered this. The Mongols discovered this. The Persians discovered this. History is littered with the ruins of empires that believed the rules did not apply to them. And unless something fundamental changes, not promises of change, not plans for change, but actual, measurable, painful change in how money is created and spent, America will discover this too. The clock is ticking. The pattern is unfolding. The question is only whether enough people will understand it in time to change its course. As you reflect on what you've learned today, consider what this means for your own decisions, your own preparations, your own understanding of the world we live in. History is not merely a collection of entertaining stories about dead people and interesting costumes. It is a laboratory where we can observe patterns that remain active in our own time, a warning system that our ancestors built with their triumphs and their failures. The collapse of empires is not an event but a process, and that process follows recognizable stages that we can identify and perhaps interrupt. If this exploration of history and economics has given you something to think about, I'd be genuinely interested to hear your perspective in the comments. Where do you think America truly stands on this trajectory? What would it take to change course? Is it already too late, or is there still time? These are questions that deserve serious discussion, and this community has always brought insights I never could have anticipated on my own. If you found value in this journey through the rise and fall of empires, consider sharing it with someone who needs to understand these patterns, someone who might benefit from seeing the present moment in historical context. And if you want to continue exploring the hidden connections between past and present, the forces that shape our world in ways that are rarely discussed in mainstream discourse, then you already know how to stay connected. The next chapter of this story is still being written, by policymakers and central bankers and ordinary citizens, and understanding it may be the most important thing any of us can do.